Be honest, how many times have you woken up promising yourself that today is the day everything changes? You're going to work harder, eat better, and finally stop wasting your life on that screen. And for 48 hours, you actually do it. But then, a bad night's sleep or a stressful afternoon happens. And quietly, without a sound, that new you just vanishes. Most people think they lack willpower. They're wrong. The problem isn't your energy, it's your understanding of discipline. 4 centuries ago, the samurai discovered a secret in the dusty training grounds of Japan. They didn't treat discipline like a muscle to flex. They treated it like breathing. Welcome to the art of Shu-Ha-Ri. Today, we'll learn how to get rid of those excuses. The strange thing is, it's not about laziness. Most people who fall into this pattern aren't lazy. In fact, they're quite motivated in ways. The problem isn't energy, it's something else entirely. Something a group of warriors discovered 4 centuries ago, not in a psychology lab, not in a personal development seminar, but in the dusty training grounds of feudal Japan. The samurai didn't think of discipline the way we do. For us, discipline is usually something we call upon when we need it, a kind of emergency reserve we resort to when our motivation runs out. We treat it like a muscle we only tense when the weight gets heavier. Samurai, however, treated it like breathing, not something you activate, just something you never stop doing. At the heart of samurai life was a concept called Shu-Ha-Ri. It's not a productivity trick. It's not a morning routine tip either. It's a way of understanding how a person transforms. Not temporarily improving, but truly differentiating. And when you understand that, you start to see it everywhere. In people who seem to have figured things out. In places where you've failed before. In the very gap between who you are and who you aspire to be. Shu is the first stage. The word roughly means to protect or obey. In the old training halls, a student would come to a master and receive a single technique. Not a curriculum, not a framework, just one thing. And for months, sometimes years, they would do the same thing, the same hold, the same stance, the same cut. Not because the master was hiding wisdom. On the contrary, the master understood something about the human mind that most of us deeply resist. True change happens, not when we understand something, but when the body stops thinking about it. This is the part that bothers people. We live in a culture obsessed with understanding. We want to know why before we decide how to do something. We want to see the whole picture before taking the first step. So we read, research, plan, and somehow the act of doing is constantly postponed. The samurai tradition didn't have the patience for that. It wasn't anti-intellectual. It was deeply practical. Before the mind can freely explore, the hands must know what to do without being asked. Think about the last time you learned something physical. Maybe it was driving a car, writing, or cooking a dish you've made dozens of times. While it's hard to pinpoint exactly when, there was a moment when you stopped thinking about the steps and just started doing. The process transformed into something quieter than conscious effort. This change isn't just convenient. That's the point. Because when a behavior falls below the level of decision-making, it stops competing with your mood, your energy, your will. It just happens. That's what Shu is trying to build. Not a shallow habit, not just something you do over and over again, but a foundation that no longer needs to be picked at. The samurai student didn't practice the same technique because the master lacked imagination, because mastery isn't a goal. It's a quality of movement that emerges after the friction is gone. But that's where it gets interesting. Because Shu alone trains soldiers, not warriors, followers, not masters. The second stage, Ha, means breaking or leaving. Once the student has so fully assimilated the technique that it has begun to live in their muscles, the master begins to offer variations, challenges, situations where the original form doesn't quite fit. And now that the student is fundamentally fluent, they can begin to ask questions. They can begin to feel where the rule is the rule and where it's just a starting point. This is the stage most people skip entirely. We either get stuck in Shu, doing exactly what we're told, never developing our own understanding, or we jump straight to Ha without ever establishing the foundation. We want to be creative before learning the craft. We like to make exceptions before we understand what we're making exceptions to. And then we wonder why the results are inconsistent. Why progress comes in sudden bursts and then stops. People who seem to have real discipline, those who don't struggle like we do, have almost always gotten through it without skipping a beat. When life took a turn for the worse, they had built something solid enough, as something to hold on to. They eventually broke the rules with understanding, not impatience. A researcher named Roy Baumeister studied for years what he called ego exhaustion, the idea that willpower is a limited resource that dwindles day by day. His early work suggested that every decision you make has a cost, and by evening you are exhausted. Later studies complicated the picture, but the basic observation remains valid. The more conscious decisions you have to make to do something, the harder it becomes. The samurai, without knowing Baumeister's name, built an entire philosophical system to solve precisely this problem. Eliminate the decision. Make the behavior so ingrained that it doesn't require choice. That's the stage where a person begins to take ownership of their own practice. It's the stage where they begin to see that the form they've learned is a map, not territory. It's the stage where they develop judgment not about whether or not to follow discipline, but about how to intelligently apply it to situations the original rules never foresaw. That's why the best practitioners in almost every field eventually appear effortless. The reason wasn't that they stopped caring, but that they didn't have to force it. And then there's Ri, the final stage. The word means to detach, to transcend, to completely detach from form. This is the most difficult stage to describe, because from the outside it doesn't look like discipline, it looks like freedom. The master swordsman who goes through a fight and afterward can't quite explain every choice he made. The experienced surgeon whose hands seem to be thinking to themselves. The writer who no longer notices the rules of language, who becomes invisible, so deeply absorbed that he shapes everything without making himself known. Ri is not carelessness. It's not breaking the rules for the sake of novelty. It's what happens when structure becomes internal. When discipline ceases to be something you carry and becomes a part of how you move in the world. The samurai who reached this stage weren't trying to be disciplined, they simply were. Most of us can never approach Ri because we misunderstand what the path looks like. We think transformation should feel like progress, linear, upward, visible. We expect each week to be better than the last. And when it doesn't, when there are weeks when we feel like we're treading water or regressing, we interpret that as failure. We revise the plan. We start over. We choose a different approach. But the samurai didn't change their plans. Not immediately, of course. They trusted in the form, even when it felt like a constraint. Especially then, because Shu is not comfortable. It requires a special kind of patience, rarely taught by our culture. To start again without any visible setback. The patience of someone building something underground. In the dark, before any sign of change appears on the surface. There's a question worth silently contemplating, without answering it aloud. Not yet, just holding on. Think about the one thing in your life you constantly return to, try to change, build, or become. How many times have you started? And each time you started, did you start with Shu, with a genuine commitment to the form, without understanding, without seeing the results? Or did you start with expectation, with a silent bargain? I'll do this until I see it work. Because that bargain is what solves everything. A samurai student practicing 10,000 sword strokes wasn't counting for a reward. He was becoming someone for whom that stroke was simply what it was. The reward was invisible, until one day, under pressure, the blade moved without hesitation, and he realized something irreversible had changed. That is the silent promise within Shu-Ha-Ri. It doesn't mean it will be easy. It doesn't mean it will feel good. But if you trust the form long enough and let it settle within you, on the other side of that patience, you will be something unrecognizable from where you started. Not because you tried harder, because you became different. The samurai understood something we mistakenly learn throughout our lives. Discipline is not something you possess. It is something you earn slowly, silently, persistently.